Today's procurement teams have to meet a dizzying array of internal and external challenges. They must be responsive and risk resistant. They must respect and even improve the environment and be as inclusive as possible. They must serve the needs of internal buyers, global suppliers, and the bottom line. And perhaps most importantly, they must achieve all of this seamlessly and efficiently. But the foundation for procurement success, and I think its future impact, is data. And yet, using accurate data to drive decision-making remains one of our greatest challenges. And so, we partnered with Sievo and Buyers Meeting Point to take a deep dive into procurement data ecosystems. In this special series, Kelly Barner and I will explore how procurement leaders can meet their analytical requirements while also exploiting the full cross-functional value of data. Data that serves as the foundation for enabling corporate growth and competitive advantage. And so every 2 weeks between April and July 2021, Kelly and I will speak with senior level executives at Risk Methods, Basware, Supplier IO, EcoVadis and Sievo, companies at the forefront of the procurement data revolution. All of the episodes in this series, in addition to an ebook that accompanies the series and that is written by Kelly, can be found at artofprocurement.com/data series. That's artofprocurement.com/data series. In this fifth and penultimate episode of the series, Kelly speaks to Magnus Bergfors, Global Business Director at Basware. Kelly and Magnus discuss the evolving role of procure-to-pay technology in helping procurement satisfy business objectives, while also improving the internal user and supplier experiences. So let's go into the show as I hand off to Kelly, asking the first question of their discussion.
Magnus, so perhaps you and I should start this conversation with a conversation about terminology. Right. So there's a lot of terms that are sometimes used interchangeably, more outside of procurement, maybe than within. Things like e-procurement, source to pay, procure to pay, source to settle. Those are all commonly used. What do you hear, or maybe your own preference, prefer to use most often when you have these conversations? And where would you say that Basware specializes?
Well, to me, they actually mean quite different things, with the exception of source to pay and source to settle, which I think, in my definition, in my book, are the same. But e-procurement is the smallest component here, if you will. So e-procurement in my world is half of procure-to-pay. So it's basically the workflow, PO creation, requisitioning, and so on. And in combination with catalog management. So it's the procurement end of procure-to-pay, if you will. So when you move into procure-to-pay, then you add e-invoicing and AP invoice automation capabilities to that. And then the next scope is to then add strategic sourcing capabilities like e-sourcing and contract management, and spend analysis and supplier management capabilities to form that end-to-end source-to-pay or source-to-settle suite. So they're not always used in that fashion. I would agree with that. And especially procurement can be tricky because in the public sector, that tends to be the same as source to pay. So it is confusing. But in my world, e-procurement is part of procure-to-pay, and procure-to-pay is part of source-to-pay. And I would say that the most common one nowadays is procure-to-pay. And this is the area that Basware plays in.
Now, over the course of your career, what are some of the things that you have seen change in the role of the procure-to-pay technology or in the space in general?
Well, there's been an evolution here. I mean, if you go back to when we started seeing these more specialized procurement solutions roll out, I mean, if you go back far enough to the early 90s and so on, the what we would call procure-to-pay or e-procurement today were typically part of the ERP system. And then we saw that being broken out into initially marketplaces in the sort of .com era, where there was the sort of the grand visions of connecting everybody to marketplaces and so on. But since then, it's matured, and sort of the reality is catching up a bit more with the vision. But it's still a fragmented space. But it's been moving from point solutions to broader suites. And now in the last couple of years, we're starting to see sort of more specialist solutions again. So there's a huge amount of innovation in this area. And customers are requiring more and more deep functionalities and customizable and configurable capabilities to ensure that you manage all of the spend. So it's been going from specialists to broader suites, and now it feels like the pendulum is swinging back towards specialized solutions.
Interesting. Now, you talk about the types of things that customers are increasingly asking for. Do you get a sense from your conversations with them, or even potentially the details of how they end up using that functionality, where that drive is coming from within the business? Are there specific objectives that they're saying, hey, we need this added functionality, or we need these changes ultimately made, we need to broaden our scope because the business is asking us to do X and Y? What do those conversations typically go like?
Yeah, there's a number of different sort of aspects to this. I mean, if you go back, let's say 2 years or a year and a half at least before the COVID pandemic broke out, there was a sort of a focus on digitalization. So it was pretty vague actually. In many cases, it wasn't much of a business objective as such. It was more we need to digitalize. And when I before I joined Basware, I worked as an analyst and I had a lot of these discussions with end users around what is it that you're actually trying to achieve. And that was quite interesting in some cases because there wasn't a clear business objective underlying it. And I think that is a really important part, because if you don't know why you're doing it, then you don't know when you're successful. But obviously, then since the pandemic hit, there's been a lot more uh, sort of real clear focus on what we need this to continue to work. So obviously, the whole remote working aspect of things have really driven towards electronic invoices and those types of things. So you don't have to be present in person and sign papers and circulate papers and so on. And obviously, also visibility has become much more important. So understanding what is going on in the organization, where in the process are we, but also at the bigger stage, what are we spending our money on, with our, who are we spending it with, and so on, to be able to basically plan and to adopt to the changes that are recurring. So now over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've seen the sort of the digitalization to enable work from home and automation for that matter, and the visibility to be able to be agile and drive resilience.
Now, it's interesting that you bring up that visibility, and maybe let's stay there for a moment, because obviously the role of data, investing in data, ensuring data quality is incredibly important and a very common conversation within procurement right now. For organizations that are on some type of transformation journey, what advice do you tend to give them around their data and their visibility, generally speaking, even above and beyond the specific procure-to-pay technologies and processes that go along with that?
Well, the first thing is, again, coming back to the business objective. So understanding why you need this visibility and what it is that you want to achieve, because that will also then put different requirements on what you're using. I mean, I personally think that the more granular data and the more good quality data you can have, it never hurts. But obviously, there are costs associated with that in sometimes as well. But building from the bottom up, I would say, making sure that you have the capability to capture data at a granular and electronic in an electronic way to ensure that you don't have loss of quality or loss of information along the line. So we've seen, I mean, spend analytics solutions have been around for 20, 30 years by now almost.
Absolutely.
And I'm a big fan of spend analytics, but the problem has been that the data that we've been feeding these solutions to analyze has been so poor. It's been header level. It's been at the best sort of supplier names and accounting codes and so on. You can only do so much with that. So to get to the next level, you need to ensure that you have line level descriptions and all that good quality data to drive to go to the next level to really get the full value from it. So I would argue that if you're going to drive towards this, you need to understand what it is that you're trying to do so you have the right ambition, and then make sure that you set that data foundation to capture data at the right level, in the right format, at the correct quality.
And obviously knowing what you're trying to achieve is incredibly important. And those conversations can be had with procurement, right? And there is always maybe a risk that what they're stating as their objective is their perception of
Mm.
what's required of them, versus something that they have already specifically had a conversation about. Do you find that it's valuable to have the business involved in some of those early on conversations, just to sort of sanity check around what the true objectives are? Or do most procurement teams and leaders seem already pretty clear, pretty focused on what their objectives are before they start bringing in the technology?
No, I definitely think that the discussion needs to take place because uh, even procurement people that work in procurement doesn't necessarily have the full picture in front of them. And if we look at procure to pay, in my experience, the emphasis tends to be much more on the first P in procure to pay, so the e-procurement part, if you will, because that's typically sort of procurement's home ground. It's orders, it's requisitions. And even if it's transactional, it's still sort of within the boundaries of procurement. But to me, the second P is as important, and you could almost argue even more important, because that's where you capture all the spend.
Yeah.
Because everything at the end of the day goes on an invoice, or virtually everything at least, while not everything necessarily goes on a requisition and a PO. So I think having that discussion and sort of opening up the eyes of the procurement folks that it's bigger than just procurement is quite often important. But the problem is that there's still in a lot of organizations this sort of functional divide between procurement and finance. So bridging that gap and understanding that procure to pay is one process that starts with the requisition, or you could argue it starts even earlier, but from a transactional perspective, it starts with a requisition and ends with a ready to pay file or even a payment, depending on how far you want to take it. So, sort of having that discussion around what is the scope and where do we start is quite important, because it's easy to just sort of focus in on one area without realizing that there's a bigger picture to be addressed.
Absolutely. And of course the idea, whether you happen to discuss it in terms of transformation or digitization, that's all great and fun and exciting and future oriented until the day comes that you're expected to start changing the way that you do things. That's sort of the
Yeah.
less fun part, even though it's what ultimately gets you to those objectives. When it comes to the actual change element, what part of digitizing P2P, or maybe what type of information, do you tend to see as the most difficult to allow that change to happen with?
Well, first of all, I think, as you say, that whole change management aspect is quite often overlooked. I mean, if you look at the implementation time that some vendors sort of use in their marketing, it's just not realistic from that perspective. Technically, yes, but the change management part is often neglected. So I think the difficult part is to reach these end users, and all these end users in the organization that buy things, and that this is where the complexity comes in, because if you compare to sales, I mean, there are salespeople and they are the ones that are selling. On the procurement side, it's a bigger
That's right.
problem because everybody's buying stuff,
Yes.
more or less, and they're buying all sorts of things. On the sell side, you sell sort of a couple of things that tend to be quite related, or a few groups of things, but on the buying side, you buy everything. So I think that's the complexity that is often underestimated. That you go into it and you say, well, we'll put things in catalogs, or we will use free text orders or e-forms, but that really doesn't cover the whole world, because there's a lot of stuff that you have no idea what it's going to cost up front. So how do you deal with those?
Mhm.
And the fact is that a lot of the end users in the organization are probably already using solutions that are able to create purchase orders. So you have transportation management systems, you have field services management systems, you have enterprise legal systems, and so on, where these users, they're already using these tools. So why not make sure that they can keep using those, but integrate those? So it's taking that full complexity into consideration and understanding how are people actually ordering and how are they working is something that I think is quite often not really investigated or actively ignored, because
Yeah.
you're saying we're buying this fancy system and we want everybody to go in there. But I mean, procurement is a service organization to the rest of the organization. We're there to enable them to do their job, not to force them into a particular system and create a PO that perhaps doesn't add value to them. We want to make sure that we have compliance and that we're driving spend towards the preferred suppliers and so on. But we can do that in a multitude of systems, not only the procure-to-pay system.
No, and that's true. I actually think, from my own perspective, one of the more interesting, I don't know, movements, concepts that has really started to gain traction within procurement over the last couple of years is this notion of the customer experience. And
Yeah.
let's be honest, right? There's been a procurement customer experience since there was the first procurement person. But because we didn't specifically design it, nurture it, gather feedback on it, study it, it wasn't always that great. When you think about the P2P specifically, what seems to be the most important usability factors that offer an opportunity to contribute to or improve that customer or user experience?
There are a couple of things. I mean, obviously, we can learn a lot from the consumer facing applications when it comes to sort of the design and simplification of these solutions. So, I mean, the fewer the clicks, the better. And I mean, there's a whole host of tools to track that and analyze the behavior of the buyer. But I also get back to what I was talking about earlier here. The if a buyer is already using a system, I mean, the best user experience for him is to continue to do that
True.
and then make sure on our end that we are able to receive that information that they're creating and reuse that for our purposes. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, I think, is drive automation as far as possible. We're seeing a lot of approvals and those types of steps that they're necessary, but they could probably be automated, because at the end of the day, there are managers out there that sit and approve hundreds of requisitions and invoices, and I will bet you money that they're not taking much detailed look at any of these. They're sort of auto approving them.
Yeah, and
So
you
if
won't be
you could,
surprised if I don't take that bet. I think you're 100% right about
yeah,
that.
and I think that there are smarter ways to do that. So if you can approve it against a policy, a budget, and use these data points to drive higher levels of automation, and then focus the effort on the areas where you really need to drive attention. So I think that a lot of the automation that is coming now with machine learning and AI is going to continue to improve that user experience and free up the time to focus on the important issues and really dig into those, rather than sort of manually or basically automatically just sort of rubber stamping approval. So there's a lot of, I mean, ranging from the sort of the design to where you're forcing what systems you're forcing people to use, to what they actually have to do in these systems. All of these areas can be improved, and I think we're seeing a lot of that, and then obviously a lot of new suppliers, new vendors coming into the market with fresh takes on this as
Yeah.
well. So yeah, lots of exciting stuff happening with usability right now.
Well, and to your point earlier, when you kind of broke out and you talked about the two different P's of P2P differently, right? Procurement tends to focus on the first. But the second, not only is it important because, as you mentioned, it's probably your better shot at collecting the most high quality data, but it's also incredibly important because it involves our suppliers, which are external
Yeah.
partners. And so the experience that procurement needs to be focused on isn't just our internal user or customer experience. It's also increasingly this area of discussion around supplier experience. Where would you say the conversation, the trend is right now around better understanding the way that suppliers engage with companies through procure to pay, and what opportunities exist to improve that, just like we talked about some of the ways to improve things internally?
Yeah, I think there's been a change in perception, and at least in amongst sort of the pundits, if you will, around the concept of a uh, buyer of choice. So not only sort of the preferred supplier, but actually the preferred buyer as well. And we can see when there are shortages in the market that hey, the supplier, the buyers that have treated their suppliers poorly might not be getting supply. So I think there is at least a beginning of this sort of realization and a lot of discussion around supplier collaboration. So not sort of just bringing the big hammer to the negotiation and driving the price down, but actually making sure that you capture value from suppliers. So I think that's a great first step. But again, then if you start looking at the tools and the system and how they are being used, I think we're still lagging there because there was this grand vision, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the late 90s, around these marketplaces and connected networks and connect once and trade with everybody and so on. But that has not really materialized because there's so many networks out there that each of them are essentially a one-to-many portal for the vendors, for the suppliers, I should say. So suppliers have to connect to 50 different networks to transact with their customers. It's not really scalable for them.
Yeah.
But we're starting to see changes there, and there are, for example, in Europe now, the European Commission is pushing for standards to ensure that there's interoperability between networks and allowing a vendor to use whatever invoicing solution, for example, they want to then connect those to others to make it more scalable for the suppliers. So that's one thing, and then obviously also including the supplier as a persona when you look at the usability of your solution. The thinking is historically been that we will dictate. So if you want to do business with us, this is how you need to work. But we're starting to see that change. So you need to be more adaptable. You need to be more collaboratively sort of oriented, if you will. Dynamic discounting and supply chain financing solutions are part of this trend as well. So you offer a bit of flexibility to the suppliers that maybe they need to get paid earlier against a discount sometime or those types of things. So we're starting to see more flexibility there, but interoperability is key and better collaboration capabilities.
Well, and to your point about the supplier persona, one of the other things that I think we saw really surge in 2020 is this idea that there's actually not one supplier persona, right? There's large enterprises doing business one to one, but with so many companies pushing to build out their diversity and or small local supplier programs, you're now bringing a new type of supplier into the ecosystem that perhaps doesn't have the experience dealing with large corporations, doesn't have the systems, certainly doesn't have the people. And oh my goodness, if you think about that second P, they really, really, really want and need to be paid on time.
Mm.
How have you seen, I mean, maybe it hasn't been long enough to play out yet, but are there any early indications around how these procure to pay programs are going to have to expand and evolve to make sure that we're addressing the specific needs associated with the smaller diverse owned supplier in addition to the sort of very typical mainstream enterprise to enterprise type of buyer supplier relationship?
Well, I think that there are already capabilities in place to make sure that you're allowing suppliers options, basically. So, I mean, if we focus in on the invoicing side, for example, um, allowing suppliers to use their preferred invoicing method is one step to sort of support these smaller suppliers. So instead of forcing the suppliers to log on to a specific network or do things this way or that way, you can allow them to, I mean, use paper. Everybody can probably create a paper invoice. So there needs to be a scan and capture route to do that. PDF invoicing, I would argue that if you can create a paper invoice nowadays, you can create a PDF invoice.
Mm-hmm.
And Basware, for example, we have the capabilities to actually extract the data directly in electronic format from that PDF invoice to drive this data quality that we were talking about as well. So that PDF invoice, in practice, becomes an e-invoice. And then we have the e-invoice, which is sort of that highest level of automation, if you will, and flexibility from that perspective. But there, we're still far from, depending on where you are in the world as well. If you're in the northern parts of Europe, then most suppliers can actually send electronic invoices nowadays. But if you're in the US, for example, there's still a lot of organizations that aren't able to do that. But a PDF, they're probably able to send. So allowing those choices is certainly one way of doing it. The other way starts more at the already that strategic sourcing level, as you say. So realizing that supplier diversity is good not only from sort of a philanthropic perspective, if you will, but from a resilience perspective. So the more diverse a supply base you have, the less likely you are to be sort of left completely high and dry if something happens. I mean, there are countless examples of single source scenarios that have been quite catastrophic when something has happened. So that diversity, and even in the case where you have multiple suppliers, if they're located in the same region, then a single natural disaster could knock them both out. So the more diverse you are, the less risk you have of that. So driving that from a strategic perspective, but then also when you get down to the transaction, being able to highlight those diverse suppliers, so you can get the buyer or the requester to make that conscious choice of picking that supplier, being able to drive the analytics. So how are we actually doing against these diversity goals that we have? And then at the end of the process, allowing them to invoice in that fashion that works best for them. Mm-hmm. But with the benefit of the more electronic they are, the more you can automate that invoice approval cycle to make sure that they get paid on time or even have the option to get paid early.
Absolutely. And in terms of sort of continuing to move all of this forward, I know at Basware you've started to talk about building out a source to pay ecosystem. Can you describe that vision a little bit and what it's sort of looking like on the ground?
Well, actually, the ecosystem strategy is one of the reasons I decided to join with Basware, because it aligns with how I sort of view the world here. I mean, we still see a sense, sort of a dominance by big suite or source to pay providers, and this has been the trend for the last 10 years or so. But as an analyst, I actually saw very few good use cases or reference cases of companies doing that sort of end-to-end source to pay, one single suite for everything, and drive any levels of adoption with that. I had a standing challenge out to a couple of the big vendors to provide that reference for me that used source to pay on a global scale across 3 continents or so. And they really were never able to come back to me with that. Instead, I actually saw in the discussions, especially with the more progressive organizations, that they used a number of specialist solutions. because those solutions were the one that actually solved their business objectives. So they were using a advanced sourcing optimization solution for those use cases where they needed that. They had a specialized contract management solution to solve their issues in that process. And they had procure-to-pay or even AP broken out to make sure that they got the solution that worked best in those use cases. And then integration was done on a need-to basis. So in a lot of cases, you actually had no integration because it wasn't necessary, strictly speaking. So that's where Basware is coming from here, that we believe that in order to solve the business problem for our ideal customer profile, our ICP that we speak of internally, we need to have really deep capabilities in procure-to-pay. And we don't see that adding and diluting our resources to go into sourcing and contract management helps our customers in procure-to-pay. When there are specialist providers out there that do a great job of that. And I do think that the amount of data that is needed across all these solutions is actually far more limited than what people think. So when you start sitting down and actually looking at these different areas, sourcing, contract management, supplier management, and so on, there's typically different stakeholders using these solutions, and the data they need is not the same. There are data points that are used across these solutions, but those are fairly limited. And we're working now with APIs and so on, and you can use RPA even, or robotic process automation, to bring over the necessary data. So I do think that making sure that you have a solution that actually solves the business problem and go deep in those areas that you address is more important than trying to do all of it sort of halfway.
Absolutely. And I'm sure not only procurement, but our internal customers, and then of course our external partners in the form of all kinds of suppliers would certainly agree with that. Now, as we start to kind of wrap up the conversation, I want to challenge you a little bit, maybe just to look forward. It's been so incredibly hard. It's one of these questions over the last year, at least, I've tried to avoid asking people, although it's the thing everyone wants to know most, because, for most people, what's next? I don't know. I can talk to you about next week, maybe, but beyond that, right? Nobody has any idea. But it seems like we're starting to get to a point where planning horizons are stretching back out, maybe not as far as they would have been in 2019, but some things are starting to return to stability and normalcy enough that we can look a little bit further out. For CPOs that are starting to plan their approach to P2P looking forward, what advice, what trends, what things to look at would you recommend be high on the list for consideration?
Well, I think that they should learn from some of the experiences that we've seen throughout the pandemic here. And one of these is that a lot of companies that I've been talking to have sort of started to focus in and sort of addressed smaller chunks of the elephant, if you will. So instead of saying, hey, we're going to digitalize all source to pay, they've started in an area. So whether that's full procure-to-pay or even just sort of the network AP side, either could be the case. But making sure that, okay, let's focus in and let's get our hands around this and do something manageable that we can overview and drive quick return on investment. Instead of trying to do everything and drag it out to a 3 to 5 year program, focus on something less or a bit more limited, like AP, network AP invoice automation, for example, where you can quite quickly get result and start building from that platform and then go after piece, because technology now is shifting so quickly and there's so much innovation going on. So trying to pick this big suite today is not a good idea, because in 2 years, when you get to that sourcing module to try to implement that, for example, the market might look completely different.
True.
So start in one place and build on the success there and move on. So do it step by step as an iterative process to make sure that you're sort of up to date with the latest functionality.
Excellent. And hopefully that idea of eating the elephant one bite at a time, right? As they say,
Yeah.
sounds more achievable, sounds more straightforward. It sounds like something that teams and leaders can handle in addition to all of the other things that they have going on, some of which they have selected and prioritized, and some of which are gifted to them just by the markets and the circumstances that they're dealing with. So Magnus, thank you so much, both for sharing your expertise, obviously as a member of the Basware team, but also bringing sort of your analyst background to this conversation. I appreciate everything that you've shared with us today.
Been my pleasure, Kelly.
Thanks for listening to today's episode, part of our deep dive into procurement data ecosystems series in partnership with Sievo and Buyers Meeting Point. All the episodes will be available as they're published, alongside an accompanying series ebook at artofprocurement.com/data series. That's artofprocurement.com/data series.